It's game day, Duck fans, and I think Dillon Gabriel is having a big game today.
You are Locked On Ducks, your daily podcast on the Oregon Ducks. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Yes, it is that time once again for Locked On Ducks. I'm your host, Spencer McLaughlin. Thank you so much for making this your first listen or your first view of the day. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day and your number one source to stay up to date with all things Ducks. Today's episode brought to you by our friends over at FanDuel. Place your first $5 bet. You'll get started with $200 in bonus bets. Guaranteed. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. Three important players for a dominant win. Offensive line questions. Dillon Gabriel all coming up on today's show. I've already made my predictions, so no spoilers here since I did that on yesterday's crossover episode with Matt Sheehan of Locked On Spartans. I've got Oregon winning 38-10. Very similar, if not identical, prediction to what I had against UCLA. I think it'll be in that sort of range. I can see a world where Oregon struggles in this game for a little while and pulls away, much like the Oregon State game. You have a staff that was once at Oregon State. The game plan is going to be very similar, but I think Dillon Gabriel's in for a big day. And my reasoning here is twofold. Number one, Michigan State's defense this year is better than UCLA's. That doesn't mean that it is great. They have not fared incredibly well, though the first half against Ohio State, they played a respectable brand of football. That was at home. This is on the road. We'll see if they can get it done. They almost beat a pretty good Boston College team on the road in messy weather conditions. It's not as if they haven't shown glimpses of why Jonathan Smith was hired and why a lot of people, myself included, are optimistic about the team he can build. I just don't think he has a team that's capable of hanging around with Oregon for 4 quarters, but could they do it for 2? Could they maybe even do it for 2.5 to 3? Sure, but I don't think they could do it for more than 3, and my guess would be 1.5. This game stays close for 1.5 quarters, and then Oregon eventually kind of leans on their talent on both sides of the ball, and it eventually starts to matter, and they pull away. But I think that's going to start offensively with Dillon Gabriel, and the two reasons I alluded to earlier are these. Number one, Michigan State, though they are better than UCLA defensively, they're not great, but so far, they've done well against the run, at least statistically. Now, does that mean that every single game has been phenomenal? No, of course not. Last time out against Ohio State, the Buckeyes ran for 185 yards and 2 touchdowns. They threw for just under 300 yards and a few touchdowns in a 38-7 win. And if Oregon puts up that sort of score, I think that should give Duck fans a lot of confidence going into next week's game against Ohio State. But Michigan State, I think, has been better against the run than they have against the pass. And so when you factor that in with reason number 2, which is that Oregon is not afraid to lean on Dillon Gabriel, who's completing an astonishingly high 84% of his passes. Do you realize he'd be one of the 10 most accurate quarterbacks in college football if he completed 10% fewer passes? If 1 out of every 10 passes that he has completed this year were incomplete or interceptions, he'd still have a 74% completion rate. I think my math checks out there, but you get what I'm trying to say. He's been crazy efficient, but I think we saw in the Idaho game in particular, if Oregon's not able to run the football, they will just throw it. They will slice and dice you to death. Death by 1,000 cuts, create a chunk play every now and then. Certainly I want to see that explosive element from the passing game here. But if that's Michigan State's strength and their defensive line has played better than basically everyone expected them to after losing our guy Derek Harmon and Simeon Barrow, who went down to Miami and is starting for the Hurricanes, they've played better than you thought this year. And you factor in that Oregon's offensive line has been good but not great so far in the run game. I don't know that I expect Oregon to go off for 250 to 300 yards on the ground. They haven't broken explosive running plays so far this season that haven't been with Dillon Gabriel. It's been solid. It's been fine, but I don't know that Oregon is going to be able to. I would love to see them just rattle off 15 to 20 yards on 5 to 6 carries this year, or have Jordan James break a 40 to 50 yard touchdown. That just hasn't happened yet. Maybe this is the week, the second full game with a full week of practice where this offensive line is a starting unit. Maybe this is the game where that pops. But if you're playing against Michigan State's strength with an aspect of Oregon's offense that's been good but not great so far, I think you could get pass happy. And I don't think that's a bad thing, because that's a good thing overall for Oregon's offense, that you aren't pigeonholed into, hey, you have to do this, or, like Michigan State, you have to run the ball or their whole offense doesn't work. Like, if Oregon doesn't run the ball, obviously you want to be able to be balanced, but it's not as if they can't move it. It's not as if they have no ability to just call straight drop back passing, kind of go air raid like they did against Idaho. I know that wasn't a beautiful offensive game. They still moved the ball when they needed to. They didn't run it great against Boise State. It was just okay. So I think Gabriel's in for a big game here. I think he goes over 300 passing yards. I think he'll have a couple touchdowns. I think Evan Stewart creates an explosive play in this game, and I think that's just fine. I don't think that Oregon has to go for 250 on the ground for me to feel good about the offense, but I think that matchup definitely favors Dillon Gabriel here to be more involved, because we've seen it with Will Stein. Whether you like it or not, he will allow Dillon Gabriel to have an RPO on every play, to not have to just straight hand the ball off. They don't run a lot of just duo concepts or pin and pull power or tosses, and they do that every now and then, but there's a lot of RPO. And I think with this Michigan State secondary, they've got a couple of injuries on the defensive side of the ball and the offensive side of the ball as well. I think this Oregon receiving core is playing at exactly the level I expected them to be. It can be a different guy every week. They're creating explosive plays. They can run short routes. They are all tremendously versatile. They can get involved in pop passes and screens. You can do it with all these guys. But Evan Stewart had, I think it was 3 catches for 27 yards last week. I'd expect him to have a bigger game, but I won't be surprised if he's kind of quiet again. I got a message from somebody saying, hey, is Evan Stewart, disappointing? He's supposed to replace Troy Franklin's production. Not exactly. That's not the way I viewed Evan Stewart's arrival to Oregon. It's, hey, this is a really great piece to have, because if Tez is off for being double covered, or if Trayshawn Holden goes down, or if he's not having a great game or not creating separation, you want to have a guy who can just be that dude, who can be a go-to, but who doesn't have to be a go-to. I mean, Evan Stewart hasn't been a go-to guy thus far in his career. I think he has a big game here. I'd say if you gave me a prop, I'd pick Evan Stewart over 5 receptions and over 75 yards in the air, because the way this receiving core statistically has worked, there have been a lot of ebbs and flows. There have been a lot of ups and downs. Evan Stewart led Oregon in receiving against Boise State. Tez Johnson has led Oregon in receiving in every other game. And yeah, it's the safest bet to say Tez will lead the team in receptions and yards, because now they're taking explosive shots with him, which they have before, but he's, a little bit more of a short to medium yardage guy in terms of his depth of target. And I just love the way this receiving room is playing. So I think Stewart pops. I think everybody gets involved as always, but I wouldn't be surprised if Michigan State loads up, tries to stop the run. And look, maybe they look at this Oregon team and say, hey, they haven't run the ball incredibly well. We actually want to sit with 2 deep coverage, and we want to make you try and run the football against a light box, because we don't know how well Oregon's offensive line can do that. That's where you'd love to see a lot of pushes like the types they had in the Oregon State game. But I think Dillon Gabriel's in for a big day. Let me know your thoughts in the YouTube comments, or hit me up on X, formerly known as Twitter. Lots of things to get to on today's show. 3 important players. Not 1, not 2, but 3 important players for Oregon to win big. 1 on offense, at least. That's coming up next. Coming up right now, FanDuel. NFL fans, you can start the season with a big return on FanDuel. A big return on FanDuel. That's America's #1 sportsbook, which is really neat because it's not number 2, it's not number 3, it is number 1. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. Do you feel great about Oregon minus 23.5? Well, good for you. You can bet it at FanDuel. Do you not feel great about Oregon minus 23.5? Also good for you. You can bet that at FanDuel. On the other side of things, you can hedge your happiness, as some people have called it. You'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. So you're missing out on that if you haven't checked out FanDuel already, which is why you need to get over there. FanDuel.com. That's where you get America's #1 sportsbook, at FanDuel.com. Little game day. Game day, second segment sip, because, well, it is indeed game day as this show drops. I'll have a reaction show up later tonight. It will be done in a timely manner. I have no other conflicts. I can sit down, watch the entire game, every single play, start to finish. I can't wait. Cannot wait. I dig the Friday night games only for that reason. I don't dig them because they tend to lead to craziness. How can Oregon avoid craziness against Michigan State? Just play the way you're capable of. So, one thing that I didn't have in my keys to the game from yesterday that I'll get to, but first 3 players who I think are important for Oregon, one of whom I've already talked about, and I'll get to him last. I want to start with Marcus Harper. Marcus Harper is Oregon's lowest graded offensive lineman according to Pro Football Focus. He has not been good. And when I've watched him play, it's not like he's getting beat routinely or that he's been just absolutely horrible, needs to be replaced or anything like that. I just know that there is another gear. And I talked about him earlier this week as an Oregon player that can improve dramatically from what he has shown so far. His PFF grades are bad, under 60 overall. And he's never been a dominant run blocker, but he hasn't been as prolific. Again, according to Pro Football Focus, make of that whatever you like. I think they do a good job grading offensive linemen. The only objection I have is they factor in a receiving grade sometime. I don't get that. I do not understand that element of it. But I think they have seen what I've seen, which is Harper's been fine. But I want him to take another step forward. And this is a Michigan front four that's going to be able to test the Ducks' offensive line in a way they probably haven't been tested yet. Now, if you did a one-to-one comparison, Michigan State's defensive line, Boise State's defensive line, those are the 2 most talented teams Oregon has played to date. I mean, you can probably go back and forth. You might even give the edge to Boise State. And if you recall, Oregon's offensive line wasn't great in that game. They weren't creating a lot of running lanes, and they weren't as good in pass protection as they should have been. They figured it out more in the second half. They played really well against Oregon State. They played well against UCLA last week. They were certainly better in pass protection than they were in run blocking. And I'll talk about the offensive line once I get something out of my eye right there. That was highly irritating. Highly irritating. Okay, we can move on now. So Marcus Harper, that's the one guy along the offensive line I think that is the furthest from his full potential. All those guys can get better. I think Connerly can still improve. Cornelius, after a rough first game against Idaho, I think he's been Oregon's best offensive lineman so far. PFF feels the same way. Nishad Strother, been really solid. Poncho, been really solid. Good snaps, and I thought Poncho had an awesome game, and Strother as well, against Oregon State in particular. When Oregon wants yardage, they've had a tendency in the last couple of weeks to run behind the left side of that offensive line. And that's Nishad Strother, that's Josh Connerly. So I want to see the right side pick it up because I know Cornelius is playing well, and I think Marcus Harper is the key. So that's the first guy. Second guy that's important here, Jeffrey Bassa. He said this week at practice in a media availability that he's back to 100% for the first time since the Idaho game. Hallelujah. Oregon's all-conference linebacker is feeling 100%. He certainly looked that way last week against UCLA. Didn't have a huge number of tackles, but did have a sack, had a pass breakup. I believe it was his first sack since the Holiday Bowl against North Carolina. It had been a minute. Now, he's generated quarterback pressures, and he does a lot of things on the field. But Oregon's got to keep him at 100%, especially going into Ohio State. But there are 2 reasons I think he really matters in this game. Number one, when Oregon struggled against the run playing Boise State, part of the reason that was the case, Jeffrey Bassa did not have his best game, didn't look like he was at 100%. If he's back to himself, Michigan State does not have a couple of backs that are as good or anywhere near as good as Ashton Jeanty, who's the best running back most likely in all of college football this year. But if you're going to defend the run well, especially when your base personnel is to have 5 defensive backs on the field, your linebackers have to be really, really good stopping the run. So Jeffrey Bassa needs to just be Jeffrey Bassa. He's got to be that guy against the run. But the second factor is I wonder how often he is called upon, and Betcher could do this as well. We know he's got plenty of range. Did you know that he plays center field on the baseball team? Didn't know if you'd heard, but Bryce Betcher plays baseball for Oregon. He's a really good player too. So, the quarterback spy, I wonder how often this comes into play. Childs is tremendously mobile. He can run with the best. He's not, a speed runner per se, but he is a long strider. He is very mobile. He'll have naked boots where you might have a linebacker who's responsible for the quarterback, or you might, in a drop back passing situation, instead of running cover 2 man, you might decide to go cover 1 and say, no, we have to have a linebacker spy the quarterback. That's been Jeff Bossa for the last couple of years. And so if he's going to play that role, he's got to play it well, or else Aiden Childs will pick up some 3rd and 7s that'll make Oregon fans rip their hair out because you're like, everybody was covered, there was no one open, and Childs makes the play anyway. Or what you might call the Marcus Mariota effect. It's like, wow, we called the perfect defense and he just ran for the first down. We had a spy on, but he was too fast. Now, Childs is not as fast as Mariota, but he's got wheels. Like, he can move. And he's been running this year. I think he's run for 150 yards or so in the first few games. They won't have a ton of design quarterback runs. Maybe they break that out this week. But at the very least, when he drops back to pass, you have to be conscious of his ability to run. And that applies to defensive linemen too. Rush lane discipline has to be there in ways that it wasn't against Giovanni McCoy, who's a more mobile quarterback for Oregon State than Ethan Garbers was for UCLA. They cannot allow there to be big, massive, wide open gaps for Childs to run through because he'll take it. He'll absolutely take it, and he should. But that's why Jeff Bossa is key player number 2. And key player number 3, talked about him earlier, Evan Stewart. So one of my keys to the game for Oregon to getting a big win is creating explosive pass plays. Tez Johnson caught the long touchdown against UCLA. That was awesome. It was a really cool play design from Will Stein. You fake the quarterback run or speed option, and then you have the double post, and Gabriel lays it out. Love seeing Tez create explosive plays. Not a primary feature of his game. It is more of a primary feature of what Evan Stewart can do. And I think Stewart, when this offense is lining up in base personnel, like a standard passing concept, whatever you want to call that, is going to have Tez Johnson running the short to intermediate route. Trayshawn Holden can do literally anything on the football field, gadget plays, short route, deep comeback, like anything. But Stewart needs to be the deep threat. And I think back to the Boise State game when he caught a couple of big chunk plays. I want to see 1 or 2 or 3. I mean, certainly I'd love to see 5 or 6. I don't think Michigan State's going to allow that. But I want to see a couple of those from Evan Stewart in this game. When I say a big key for Oregon winning big is being explosive, that comes from Evan Stewart. The guy is a crazy good route runner. Hit him with a double move, set him up in the early going. If they want to sit 2 high safeties, all right. Take the Oregon State approach. Let Evan Stewart just cook whoever's going to try and guard him at corner. I don't think Michigan State's got the horses to keep up. The Beavers certainly didn't, and they learned that in the game. But eventually, if you keep taking 8 to 10 yards and they start to cheat up, give me a deep shot. Give me a deep shot, and I want that to be to Evan Stewart because I think he's Oregon's best, most consistent deep ball threat, who is also a really, really talented guy in 50-50 situations. Now, he hasn't had to do that this year when Gabriel pushes the ball to him down the field because he's usually just creating a bunch of separation. So, Evan Stewart, key player number 3. And then one kind of honorable mention key to the game that I wanted to talk about before I talk about the offensive line more to wrap up today's show. If Oregon forces at least 2 turnovers in this game, they'll pull away quickly. Like, obviously, if they come in the first half, and I say that based on the confidence I have in Oregon's offense to operate at a high level. Since the offensive line change in the second half of Boise State and the Oregon State game, the only thing that has slowed Oregon down has been Oregon. Penalties or turnovers. And they haven't actually had a lot of turnovers. There were 2 against Boise State, sloppy fumbles, but those 2 things haven't happened in the last couple of games. And guess what? Oregon's been a machine. They've been a machine offensively. I talked about it after the UCLA game earlier this week. I think they took their foot off the gas, tried to chew a lot of clock, run the football more, and just get out of there with a win and no more injuries. You could see that in the second half of this Michigan State game if they get up big in the first half. But Aiden Childs has been susceptible to turn the football over. This Oregon secondary has been opportunistic, taking the football away this year. They get a couple of turnovers. I don't think Michigan State's offense can keep up with that. The Spartans, like Oregon State in the first half, have to play a darn near perfect half of football to keep it close, which they could do. We saw Oregon State do it, but the Bees couldn't keep up for 4 quarters. I think this game looks very similar to that Oregon State game from a few weeks ago, and I've got Oregon winning 38-10. Let's talk about the offensive line, because not 1, but 2 of you sent in questions about the offensive line. So let's answer them. That's coming up next. Coming up right now, though, Game Time. Did you know they have a new feature called Game Time Picks that makes getting tickets for your favorite live events even easier? How great is that. Game Time Picks filters out the fluff. You don't want fluff, you want the meat and potatoes to show you only incredible deals on great seats so you don't have to waste time searching through thousands of tickets. Curation makes it easier to save more on sports, concerts, comedy, theater, whatever you are looking for. Get a panoramic view from your seat in the app before you buy, so you know what to expect. Their lowest price guarantee or Game Time will credit you 110% of the difference is one of many reasons that you should check out Game Time. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account, redeem code LOCKEDONCOLLEGE. That's LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off. Download Game Time today. What time is it? Game Time. Mailbag time, YouTube comments, X, formerly known as Twitter, at @SMcLaughlinCFB or at LockedOnDucks. Those are ways to get in the mailbag. If you want priority access and all sorts of other perks, go become a Locked On Ducks Insider. Link in the description below. You can get a free 14-day trial. You can talk with me one-on-one, especially during this game that I'll be watching start to finish, first snap to the final one. There are just a lot of perks to it. So that link is below. This one from Ben over there via the Locked On Ducks Insider program. Great show today. A question that I had: how do you think our somewhat stable O-line will stack up against the Michigan State rush defense, seeing that they have 15 sacks on the year? Those two stats don't exactly go together, but I'll address in a moment. Just do not want some of those Idaho, Boise sack type games. As always, go Ducks, still hoping for a 38-7, so we at least match the Ohio State spread. Well, I understand the Ohio State comparison, but who's Oregon playing this week? Oregon. That was my best collective Oregon football locker room response to Dan Lanning's perennial question of who are we playing this week? Oregon. I need to stop doing that, so I'm going to now. But the defensive line for Michigan State, 15 sacks through 5 games this year. You have to remember, if you look up any stats for Michigan State and see, wow, they've run for more yards than Oregon has this year. Well, they've played another game. Wow, they got more sacks than Oregon. Well, they've played an extra game. That matters. Still, averaging 3 sacks a game is a number I'd be happy with if Oregon were to carry that throughout the course of this season. So Michigan State's pass rush has been good. As I talked about earlier on the show, I wonder how much Michigan State loads up to stop the run because, yeah, their pass rush has been really good. I don't think they have faced an offensive line outside of Ohio State that's as good as Oregon's in pass protection. Like I have questions, as I talked about today, about Oregon's ability to run the ball consistently, whether they can make explosive run plays, whether or not they can, lean on the ground game all throughout. I think Michigan State's going to want to try to take away the rushing attack because when a team can run the football on you, that makes it really, really difficult when they also have a versatile and explosive passing attack. But maybe they look, as I talked about earlier, maybe they look at this Oregon team and say, well, no, we want to take away the passing game and make them run the football because they haven't done that supremely well. But I love this Oregon offensive line in pass protection. Since they've made the switch towards this unit that they have settled on, until whenever Matthew Bedford gets back from injury, I like them a lot more in pass protection. And part of that is the Marcus Harper factor, but part of that is everybody else too. They've been better in pass protection than they have been creating running lanes, where they've been, kind of hit and miss. And I would love to see him open up some big holes and let Jordan James really get loose, who's been around 100 yards in every single game this year. Like, Jordan James has just been really good. Whittington has been effective. Gabriel's been getting the quarterback run going the last couple of games. But I'm not overly concerned about, is Michigan State going to harass Oregon? And my lack of concern is twofold. Number one, as I mentioned, they've been really good in pass protection over the last couple of weeks. But number two, even if Michigan State starts to get disruptive, what's the hallmark of the Oregon passing game? It's a lot of quick hitters. Get the ball out of your hand. Dillon Gabriel, make a read. Introduce an RPO to the run game to get the defense off balance. That's a great countermeasure for a really good defensive line, is get the ball out quickly. You've seen teams, like FCS opponents, do that against Oregon. Like last year, I don't think they had a single sack against Portland State. And then you look at their average time to throw is like less than 2 seconds. It's just snap, read, throw. Well, all a defensive lineman can do at that point, I don't care if it's Kayvon Thibodeau on a high school sophomore, snap, read, throw, all he can do is put his hand up and try to bat it down. It's not enough time. So I think Oregon will be all right in that department. And yeah, I would love to see him play Michigan State in the same way that Ohio State did a week ago, and Ohio State had more success throwing the football than running it, which is why I think Gabriel in for a big game. This one from Desert Duck to wrap up today's show. Hey, Spencer, got a mailbag question for you. You can rephrase this however you want, but during the weekly press conference, someone asked Dan Lanning about Matthew Bedford and saving his eligibility status for one more year. Can you shed some light on this? Like, what does that mean? Is there a chance that Oregon is just going to put a pin on Bedford for the rest of the season? So you can play in 4 college football games and a bowl game, and you can get a red shirt. So this is Matthew Bedford's, I believe, 6th year of college football, expected to be his final one. If he doesn't wind up healthy, they could absolutely try to get a red shirt and get him an extra year of eligibility. I'd be surprised if that is the plan. I'd be very surprised, unless the injury is more severe than Dan or anybody is letting on with the re-aggravation, and that's entirely possible. Lanning's historically been very tight-lipped about injuries, and I don't blame him. I completely understand why that's the case. Could you find 4 games to play Bedford? I don't know. He made an appearance against Oregon State as well. I understand why the question gets asked there. I just think with the number of offensive linemen Oregon has from their past couple of recruiting classes and the availability of the transfer portal, there's going to be a lot of flux at that position next year. And if Bedford is hurt and actually can't come back until week 11, and then he can't play in 4 games, then yeah, sure, you make that consideration. I don't think you make that right now. I think if you're Dan Lanning, you're saying, okay, how do we get him back healthy? Because we think he's one of our 5 best offensive linemen, and Ohio State's coming to town next week. And if we can get him back for that game, you absolutely do it. I don't think there is any thought that should be paid towards 2025 with regards to, well, we could save a guy's eligibility for this year, except for the backup quarterbacks. Like Austin Novosad playing against UCLA instead of Dante Moore could 1,000% be an eligibility play. That I absolutely, positively believe. But for an offensive lineman, I don't think that's the way to go, and I don't think that's how Lanning and Malik Terry are going to look at it. They're worried about how do we put the best product on the field this week, and how do we get ready to do the same next week. Thanks for liking, commenting, subscribing, rating, and reviewing wherever you listen to or watch this show, and for making it your first listen of the day. Go make Locked On College Football your second. I host, giving you the biggest stories in the greatest sport on planet Earth. I'll see you all after the Oregon game tonight. Appreciate everyone listening. I'll see you next time, and until then, hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and go Ducks.